attendees so everyone can see. And just say hi. I modeled what I'm looking for. I'm Kathy. I'm from Evanston. So as you come in, we'd just like to be able to welcome you before the next minute when we will start the session. Again, it's Be Strong Families webinar series, staying strong and positive for ourselves and our children. And Andrew said hi. Andrew Hitchcock is behind the scenes. He's our tech support person today. And we're delighted to have Andrew here. Hi, Felicia from New Jersey and Michelle from Western New York. It's great to see you. Sarah from Michigan. Serenity from Utah. I like that name, Serenity. It's nice to, when you walk in the room, Serenity.
Why does that make me feel good, Serenity?
Right, it's like,
I don't know.
Serenity is here. That's awesome. Hi, Glenda from Newark. And Sarah from Abilene, Texas. Great to see you all. Well, it's noon in Chicago, so we're going to get started. Today, I'm delighted to have with me as our presenter, Judith Ehrman Shapiro. And this is part 2 of 4 on her research on homicide bereavement, which we have generalized to trauma. A corrective perspective on empowerment after trauma. 9 steps to freedom. So before we get started, just Andrew's going to launch a poll and just see how many of you were here last time for part 1. If you weren't here for part 1, Judith is going to do some review, but we're going to try to pick up where we left off so that we can get through all the steps by the end of the four sessions. So the question on the poll is, were you here at last week's webinar? Maxine, it's snowing in New Jersey. Hi, Joy. Hi, Elda. Welcome. Glad to see you. So as you're filling out the poll, I'm going to just remind everybody about the ways to engage. There are 2 ways. The first one is the text, is the chat, I'm sorry, and being able to put things in the chat. Tammy, hi, Tammy. And the chat is yours. Anytime you can ask a question, make a comment, respond to a question or respond to a comment. So that's the primary way. And then there's also the possibility of raising your hand and being able to speak. In that case, we would need to unmute you. That would be Andrew unmuting you. And then you would need to unmute yourself in order to talk. And whenever we do anything, Be Strong Families has agreements. So the agreements, which are the same for all of our webinars, are to speak from your own experience using I statements, treat other people the way you want to be treated, and be here with us now. So if you agree to these agreements, if you can do like our regulars are doing, like Michelle and Morgan and Maxine, Elda, and just say, I agree, that would be great. Without further ado, just welcome, Judith. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having done this work, and thank you for sharing it with us. Andrew, do we have, I know we have, not everybody's here yet, but of the people that filled out the poll, do we have numbers? So about 60% of the people were here last week and 40% are new with our beginning.
Welcome.
Next slide, Andrew. So Judith can start.
All right, welcome everyone. Today we're talking about creating a new perspective on trauma that involves empowering the survivor. And we called it 9 Steps to Freedom because empowerment means choice. It means that we feel we are co-creators in a situation, not just victimized, not that there's anything wrong with us, but we are people. We are everyday people responding to serious injury. I'm going to ask, thank you, Andrew. Andrew knows me, for him to turn off the slide so I can introduce myself, and we can go about doing a grounding, a little bit of a grounding exercise to begin with. Because as we spoke about last time, anytime you address trauma, anytime it's even in the abstract and you're addressing it with concerns for someone else, it can be very triggering. Just the word trauma can be triggering. So we do a little bit of a grounding experience. The more we ground, the more, in Chinese medicine, right? We talked about this. The spirit comes into the body, grounded by the earth, so that we feel more solid, more present, as Kathy was saying, and more able to tackle whatever is coming at us or in us, as the case may be. I'm Judith Ehrman Shapiro. I am a trauma survivor. My particular trauma had to do with experiencing the homicide of someone that I loved very deeply. And there are a lot of incidents of trauma, some that can't even be characterized in broad categories that we feel. This happened to me when I was a teenage girl and was probably the pivotal event of my life, and led to me in my 50s doing my dissertation on homicide bereavement. This that I'm presenting today, this week, next week, the week after, is a program that I've designed to help us just shift our perspective to one of empowerment. So with that, we're going to move into our grounding exercise. And I'd like you to just take a moment to get comfortable wherever you are. Maybe you're sitting in a chair, maybe you're lying in a bed, maybe you're standing up in the subway, but wherever you are, I'd like you to notice points of your body that are in contact with your seat, or points of your body that are in contact with the bed, or points of your body through the soles of your feet as you stand that are in contact with the ground. Take a nice deep breath with me, in through the nose and out through the mouth. And we're going to do that 2 more times. These are called grounding breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose, and gently out through the mouth. And I'd like you to bring to mind, just for a moment, with your eyes open or your eyes closed and resting, just for a moment, something that has seemed to you lately to be beautiful. Just a moment of something that said to you, wow, that's really beautiful, or something that brought you a moment of joy. So just bringing to mind where you were at that time and what happened. It's moments of beauty and moments of joy that bring us into the present moment. We have to be present to perceive them, even if they're in our memory. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share in the chat some of those things that you noticed. I noticed how quiet it was in the woods when it snowed the other day. It was perfect and it was beautiful. Anyone else?
I noticed looking out my window, in the living room, when I look out my window, I see the lake. And every time I see the lake, I think of how beautiful the trees are in the sky and the blue of the lake. And then when I look west, I see the tops of rooftops and a church steeple, and it's just beautiful. And a moment that brought me joy, I had told my sister that I was interested in moving, and she sent me a perfect listing. It was just kind of interesting. And I felt joy in that moment because she knew me and she knew what I liked. You know what I mean? Like she got it. Like on her first time out, yeah, she knew what would please me, what would delight me. And I appreciated her taking that time also to find it, So Marcy says she was remembering a moment of deep closeness with another. And Mr. or Ms. Y. Marshall Bradley says, after summer drought, then recent rain, a neighborhood hike exposed a beautiful waterfall.
Oh, that is so beautiful.
What else do we have? Who else had a moment of beauty or joy?
So whether or not you choose to share it, I thought this would be good as part of our grounding exercise, because honestly, for the rest of the time, we're going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about things that were difficult. But remember, trauma is not who you are. It is not the sum of your experiences. It can feel that way sometimes because it is the emotions of it, the feeling in the body is overwhelming. But we are also those moments. We are those moments when we see the earth, when we share our closeness with someone else, or when something touches our heart. So just to always have that to go back to as we do the work we're going to do. Andrew, you can start the slides if that's okay. So this is our corrective perspective. Go ahead to the next one. I'm doing today a very quick review of what we did last week. So we're not going to be going through all these points. But one thing we said in defining trauma is that it is about wounding. It's about injury that occurs on many different layers within our bodies that we experience in many different ways. And a lot of it is negative. There's no doubt that a lot of it is negative, but we also sometimes develop strengths, which include our critical reasoning, our ability to survive, and our ability to be in connection with others. Next slide, please. The other thing we talked about is that very often the coping strategies that come to us instinctually when we're encounter trauma are very adaptive, but from people looking inward at us, they may not seem normal. They may seem uncomfortable, or people want to kind of push it away from us. But that's because people are looking at us from the privilege of safety. They're looking at us from not having gone through the same thing. And I don't know, one thing I used to always say to myself as a young woman, I would say, well, thank God they can't understand, because I don't want them to. I just don't even want them to get it. But part of the reason we created this series is that the medicalization of trauma takes away some of the ability of the survivor to name their own experience, to really name their own strengths and their own process, because it sees us as symptoms, pathology, and passively as the receiver of what happens, that something has to get fixed, or that we're broken, or that something's wrong with us. And it can be very comforting to have medical treatment. It's just that's the way it's been developed in our society here. These definitions are from feminist scholars who have really discouraged us from staying in a victim kind of identity, and want us to move towards a survivor identity, making that just a conscious choice that we're going to do that, being actively involved in our communities with social advocacy, and the recognition that there's a full spectrum of our responses to trauma, discouraging things like alienation, but helping us to find meaning. Okay, next slide. This is what we're presenting is a participatory frame. And that means a more empowered and active frame that's going to take us through these 9 steps. They don't go in order. They can happen in any order. And go to the next slide, please. We started with this as a step, which was recognizing trauma as a transformative event. The word transformative does not mean positive change. The word transformative means important. important change, marked change, something that's notable. And we talked about how trauma happens on our emotional, physical, and social landscape in a way that we never go back. It's not homeostasis. We don't bounce back. We actually bounce forward. And we talked about that being a homeodynamic balance, meaning that our environment changes and we adapt and change. And then there are changes again, and we adapt and change. And I actually thought of a good metaphor, Kathy, for that, which is that I live at the bottom of my forest is a river. And I was thinking of the river kind of being like our lives, you know, but that every year a tree falls across the river, or branches get stuck and they dam the river in a certain way. But you know, that river keeps flowing. There's a flow that just goes on, that it goes over and around and makes use of the obstacles that have occurred within it, but it never stops going. It just rebalances. So another thing we talked about is the transformation of trauma can be very overwhelming. It's huge. It's a transformative occurrence. So that one thing that can be helpful to think about is kind of a CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy idea, that you can divide things into different areas: our emotional response, how our thought processes act, our physical perception in our body, and then behaviorally, the actions we find ourselves taking. So that was the first conversation, was recognizing trauma as transformative. You ready for the next step? Here we go. Andrew, next slide, please.
Today, one second, Judith. Yep. So you also said, like, I love this part about what you did last time, which is these steps aren't in any order, right? They're not, they don't have to, you don't go through one step to the next step necessarily. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure. You know, part of our history, again, our Western history, is that the stages of grief go from this to that to this. And we found out that empirically, when they tested it scientifically, it's just not true. Some people skip certain steps. Some people stay at a step, go to a step, come back to a step. We all have a different path that we take that makes an inherent logic with who we are. We're going to talk more about that today, actually. So I present these as just saying, here's a step, here's a step, here's a step, but they can really be experienced in any order whatsoever. Was that good?
Yeah, it's awesome. I don't know, you probably said that in the 2 slides ago, but I kind of thought, I think it's really important because it's dynamic and it's not linear, and it's individual and it's complex, and you can identify these things that happen, these steps that you go through, but everybody has their own, is just really, really, I think, very important. And it goes against, like, you know, in terms of medicalization, you know, it kind of goes against that too, you know, like.
It does. You know, it absolutely does. And I think actually just that step is empowering. Just what you're talking about is empowering, because the fact of the matter is the timing of the healing of your trauma exists within your own body. And it's Kathy's timing is not Judith's timing, because we're different people. So it is empowering just to think about that one thing.
And going back to the previous slide just for a second, Andrew, like, I feel like this is an empowering thing to remember at different places of the journey. Like, especially if you are feeling, like you said earlier, like you are your trauma, or there's nothing else than trauma. Just having this little thing in there, trauma is transformative. It's gonna open up. It's gonna change me, and it's gonna change my world. And it doesn't all have to be for bad, you know. But
Right. And the changes will not all be damaging.
Right.
It doesn't have to be that way. You know, we have this narrative that exists before we're ever traumatized. And the narrative is that somehow trauma breaks us, it damages us, we're damaged goods. And it's a terrible narrative. It really is a bad narrative. Our narrative has to be different. The story has to be the hero's journey, or it has to have another end of another narrative, because these are our biggest tests. It's our biggest opportunity to embrace wisdom. It is our biggest opportunity to grow. Can't that be part of the story as well? You know, and I'm not being Dolly Dinkle, my friend says. I'm not being like bright-sided happy, because, you know, I developed this 40 years into my trauma narrative. I suffered that whole time. So don't think I'm sitting here saying trauma's nothing. That's a bullshit. Anyway, that's bad. But I'm saying that we need a narrative that is balanced so that we can embrace all of the changes that might happen.
Awesome.
All right. So our next step, what we're going to talk about now, has a funny language to it. So I want to be clear about it. And it is, we require an understanding of the survivor's location. So see if you can kind of stick with me on this journey. The first thing I want to say is that not one of us exists in a void, right? We don't just show up when the trauma happens. We are fully fledged people before it ever happens. We're people with a cultural background, with physiology. We're people with a personality or a temperament. Trauma happens to a person in a location or a context, is another way to say that. And that's a really important idea, as is the idea that there is no single viewpoint that represents all trauma survivors, which is what we were just talking about. So in order for people to understand us, if we're the trauma survivor, or if you're working with trauma survivors or have people in your family who experience trauma, the first thing you have to know is where they're coming from, which is another good way of saying it. Where are they coming from to begin with? Each person is unique. And this is the reason why we can't all be the same, because we have different cultural backgrounds, because our bodies process things in different ways, because we have a different developmental history. And experiential means your experiences are different than mine. Maybe you've had multiple traumas and incidences of oppression, and maybe mine is more privilege. So how could I see a situation the same as you? That unique viewpoint is called your location. And very often in modern medicine, they don't want to know anything about it, right? We are in the telehealth thing for 5 minutes. Do they know our location? I don't think so.
Oh, I have a story about that, Judith. Can I share? It's been on my heart for a long time. And it speaks to the cultural piece as well. It was a meme a few years ago that was going around on Facebook. There's a Western writer named Andrew Solomon who went and talked to people in Rwanda about the genocide and after the genocide. And I'm going to just read you what it says. It says that one local said to Andrew Solomon, "We had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers who came here immediately after the genocide, and we had to ask them to leave. They came and their practice did not involve being outside in the sun where you begin to feel better. There was no music or drumming to get your blood flowing again. There was no sense that everyone had taken the day off so that the entire community could come together to try to lift you up and bring you back to joy. There was no acknowledgement of the depression as something invasive and external that could actually be cast out again. Instead, they would take people out one at a time into these dingy little rooms and have them all sit around for an hour or so and talk about the bad things that had happened to them."
Oh my God, that was so perfect.
And I think it's like, I guess maybe we don't, subscribe to depression is something that can be exercised or cast out, but that's a particular cultural viewpoint, and they have a cultural way of dealing with, depression that, that is their location,
Right.
And the Western mental health workers didn't understand their location, didn't understand what they normally do, and tried to use their own methods, which only made it worse for people. So,
right. I remember the first time I was introduced to the concept of location, and someone asked me to describe my location, and I completely froze. I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? I'm coming from a certain, like I matter, like I'm coming from a certain place. And it's really an honoring of yourself. It's a knowing of yourself that was there before you experienced trauma. And if anyone is not giving you the time of day, I want to empower you to say, excuse me, you don't understand where I'm coming from. Because you don't just exist in a void. They can't, psychologically, you can't treat people like having a cold, right? You can't say, well, take this medicine and I'll see you in the morning. That's crazy. We're too complex. We're too multi-layered. So I want to introduce you to this idea, which is that of psychological lenses. This is something we say in psychology, and it's the last point on this slide. And then we're going to ask you a question about this. And just a little aside, I forgot to say that one thing I have asked is that you have paper and pencil to kind of jot your answers to our sharing questions. That way, even if you don't want to share, which is fine, you just want to listen, take in the conversation, at least you can go back to these thoughts and kind of think about them a little bit if you want to. Psychological lenses are things that influence our location. So I wrote a list of them here. Like, first of all, obviously your personality or your temperament. Some of us are optimistic. Some of us are not optimistic. Some of us were born wide open. Some of us want to kind of stay and watch what's happening and then get involved. I mean, that's just our temperament. There's no right or wrong, and there's nothing wrong with you. We have different personalities, and that's one of our psychological lenses. What about religion and spirituality? How much does religion and spirituality affect the events that happen in your life? Well, some people would answer that question, not very much. And some people say, it is my lens. This is how I see the world. So that could be one of your lenses in which you view trauma. Core beliefs are some of the basic assumptions that each of us make. And believe it or not, we have positive core beliefs and we have negative core beliefs. Some of our negative core beliefs might be that we're not worthy, that we don't matter, that we're not good enough, we're not enough. Some of our positive beliefs are that, yes, we deserve love as much as anybody else. Or, people get grandiose and believe they deserve more than everyone else. But these are like our core beliefs that mean the most to you, and they influence how you see trauma. Politics, your personal past experience, your physical health, your culture, your society, all of these things are psychological lenses in which color the world. I like the idea of lenses. We put them on and it's how we see experience through. So Andrew, you can turn off this slide for a moment. And our sharing point with regard to this is this. I would like you to choose one of the lenses that we just spoke about and share how it influenced your experience of trauma. So while you're kind of thinking about that or typing your answer into the chat, I'll just list those lenses again. Your personality or your temperament, your religion or your spirituality, your core beliefs, your political beliefs, your past experiences that have happened to you, your cultural background, your, there are other ones I haven't even touched on. So I'm asking you to just consider, as you look at your own location, how one of these things influenced your experience of trauma. Can anyone share about that?
Who would like to share? And maybe this is something that when you think about it for a minute, you might want to raise your hand because it might be a little bit more than you can type in the chat, or you might want to type a paragraph into the chat. But how does you're asking to pick one of those lenses, one of those psychological lenses, and couple it with your location to be able to and relate it to trauma. Yeah? Related to experience of trauma. And can you give an example, Judith? Like maybe.
Yes. Here's an example. Say that there were many children born into your family, and maybe you were the youngest girl in the family. This is, after someone I actually know. And your family valued male members of your family over female members of your family for whatever reason. We won't get into that. And so there was always a sense of invisibility for you, that you were invisible. And when you experienced your trauma, part of what you encounter, part of the lens that you saw the trauma through, was that you had a lot of feelings and a lot of sensation, but that it wasn't important and no one would see you anyway. So that's an example of one way that developmentally or from your family history, there was a coloring of what you experienced in your trauma. Another way, another example, and if no one wants to share, that is perfectly all right. We will go on to the next thing. This is just an opportunity for you to be involved. Another example is what I said during this talk, which was, did we get a hand?
No.
Okay. Which was that part of my spiritual background, religious background, was that to put other people's well-being above your own. That was part of my religious upbringing. And that is why when people directly expressed a misunderstanding of my trauma experience, there was a part of me that felt, I don't even want them to understand because I don't want them to suffer. And that came from my spiritual or religious background. So, Kathy, if no one wants to share, we can go on to the next point. Anyone want to share?
There is somebody, Marcy says, the trauma that I experienced as a domestic violence survivor, I had a core belief growing up that I wasn't good enough to be treated right. I was unwanted and that I deserved nothing more than this. And this was seen as a young girl witnessing my mom. So that's a really great insight into multi-generational trauma too, right? Like that, how your experience and what you live teaches you what's appropriate. I feel like, thank you so much, Marcy, for sharing that, because
Marcy, thank you.
I can find that in myself as well. It's just, to find the piece that the messages that you got about what you deserved and and what love was. I mean, we had Ahmed Abajuradeh was on here yesterday doing an inner child workshop, and he was talking a lot about how, and he's talked a lot in his decolonization for well-being about how what you learn about what love is and then what's done to you in that context colors how you relate to other people and to yourself. Marcy says we're welcome, and it took her many years to heal from this, but she is healed. And I guess to me, Marcy, the question is going to be like, when you experience this set of workshops, how is the healing that you experience different or the same as the empowerment concept? I think that'll be interesting. And then Tammy says, my religious upbringing and marriage vows played a role in me living in a DV relationship for so long, for better or for worse. my abuser had always reminded me of this vow.
Yes. So these are such vulnerable and perfect examples of how the lenses we have make us different from other people experiencing them. Not that we're alone. We're never alone. We're never the only ones, but they color in a certain way. So if you want to understand another person's experience with trauma, you have to go back and understand the person themselves and where they're coming from. I think we can go on to the next slide if you guys are ready.
Yeah, Marcy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the next step I want to talk about, not the next step altogether, has to be acknowledging the truth, right? This is directly connected to what we were just talking about. Acknowledging the truth of the survivor's subjective, what we experience in ourselves, experience. You know, there's this thing that happens in the Western psychological conversations about trauma where, and it makes me slightly crazy, Kathy, so you can keep me in line, where they talk about what's true and what's illusory or what's fake, what's not really happening.
Distorted.
That the survivor.
Distorted.
And all I keep thinking is, you weren't in bed with me when I was up all night and couldn't get out of bed the next day because living felt like walking on glass. You weren't there. How dare you say that's fake? Each of us have to acknowledge we are different and our inner experience is our truth. Truth has multiple forms. So what I put on this slide is called radical inclusivity. And radical inclusivity has many different parts to it for many different people. But I want to talk about 3 parts that are important for our conversation. One is that one thing we pledge in a way is to remain open, and that we ourselves are not going to exclude anyone's personal view of truth. Like I said, unless you were in the house with them when it was happening, or you sat in the funeral parlor with me, you cannot say what that person's subjective experience was. And so you can't exclude it outside of the idea of trauma remaining open. The second thing is, and I have to tell you, I was going to put non-judgmental. And then I said, okay, that's silly. How many of us really get to the point where we're non-judgmental? We work so hard. But let's change that idea to something a little more realistic. Let's be aware of the judgment we pass when we listen to somebody's experience of trauma. Because if we stay aware of our own judgments, it has a dampening effect. It tunes down our own bias. So again, I'm not saying I have no biases, be non-judgmental, that's silly. I'm saying, as I know myself, I know I'm biased in certain ways. And if I can keep that hat on while I listen to someone's experience, it quiets my sense of bias. And then the last part of this that I want to talk about for radical inclusivity is that our hope is to promote broader understandings of what trauma is that are less dogmatic and less privileged. So, coming from any one of us and our station, it has a certain privilege, or maybe we get really passionate about it and strong about it, it becomes dogmatic. But we don't want to do that. We want to promote broader understandings. So that's one thing about acknowledging the truth of somebody else's experience, even if it's vastly different from what you have experienced, right? That idea that there's no single viewpoint of any certain type of trauma. And then lastly, and I'm going to read this for you word for word because I get all passionate up in this, which is survivors must not be coerced, shamed, or persuaded to describe trauma according to anything but to popular trends in culture. Even this one that I'm presenting you, or psychology, or through the insistence of oppressive political or social systems. A survivor's experience is just that. It is their experience.
So
go ahead.
So I have a question, Judith, because I'm trying to get my head around this, and I want to So, for example, if somebody says, I left my body, I left my body when it was happening, and I could see myself outside of my body, and I went somewhere else, and I met these, and there were bluebirds, and they assured me that everything was going to be all right, and those bluebirds have come to me in my dreams since then, and I feel like they are healing me. They are bringing me back to a place where I can be happy again. So that's an example of somebody's experience.
Right.
Not my experience, but it's an example of somebody's experience. What you're saying is, don't describe that as, oh, they dissociated and then they went into an illusion
fantasy that wasn't real.
That wasn't real.
And it couldn't have happened. Right.
Yeah. Right. That's don't second guess it, and don't translate it or Columbus it in a way that deprives it. Better, that you're appropriating it and putting it through your lens instead of honoring what they experienced. Is that kind of what you mean?
That is absolutely perfect. And Kathy, actually, what I try to do as a therapist, what I try to do adopting this kind of framework is I try to listen with an ear to understand it. I assume it's truth. Somebody's telling me their truth. And I try to make it make sense in my own brain. I understand that there are other levels of being, or I understand there are alternative consciousness, or I understand how symbolic we are as humans and how vitally important words are symbols. Why wouldn't a bluebird be a symbol? Or the importance of the environment and the world around us, and how blessed that person is for having bluebirds come to them, and how it's really a blessing. So I always try to find my viewpoint. How am I able to step closer to the person? Not how I am able to control them, not how I am able to make them me, not how I am able to change their narrative. It's how can I understand it in myself,
Yeah, and I think there's sometimes a common thing that people do, even, trying to be well-meaning, or trying to be, is that there's some stories that are closer to our own experience. Like maybe, I prayed and God told me, and God took care of it in this way. And then if we're religious in that same way, we hear that and we understand what that is. And so it's more comfortable for us. Whereas if somebody has a totally different spirituality, it seems we have ideas about that and we pass judgment on it, because it doesn't fit with our way of orienting ourselves.
That is perfect. So if you look at radical inclusivity, it's something for us all to practice. So when people give you their truth, you remain open. You understand that if the judgments are happening in the back of your brain, you don't have to deny them. Just be aware of them. And that automatically, because your judgment is about you, not about the other person. So you kind of, it quiets them, it quells them by just saying, okay, here's my biases or resistance coming up, and this is what it's about. And then just being open to trauma, being able to contain all of that, all of the viewpoints.
Okay, so now can I challenge you a little bit?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay.
And I want to get to everyone else, so go ahead.
All right, but so what would happen if somebody came to you and they said, I know that this was a punishment, that this is a punishment for, that was brought upon this person. Like maybe a mother says, my daughter is a child, like she wasn't following the rules. And so God punished her by her being raped, or something like that. Like I can remain open to that and that version of the truth, aware that my judgment is saying like, but also I feel like maybe that's, her interpretation of what's happening, it really conflicts with my values, or it feels like what happens when it can, like the relativism thing, what happens when it really conflicts with your values and you think like maybe an evil perception?
I think that it's not a war, and it's not a political election, and it's not about me dominating someone else or me winning or they winning. I would do this, Kathy. I would practice reflective listening. So if someone came to me and said that, I would say, first, I would be aware of my bells and whistles going off in my brain. And then I would say to them, I would hold it. And I would say to them, so what you're telling me is, so this is reflective communication. So what you just said, Kathy, is that you feel there was some kind of a cause and effect, or there was in this situation, or there was some kind of form of punishment because of the child's behavior, and that incident was connected to that in some way. Is that right? So at the end of reflecting back to someone, no matter what they say, you always say, is that right? Which throws it back to you now. You would say, no, I didn't mean to say that. And you would correct me, or you would say, yes, that's exactly what I say. So now that I've heard you, right, first step, can I just hear you? Is that okay? So I hear you, and then I say, wow, can I tell you what's happening inside of me? I could say, my stomach just went into a knot, and I stopped breathing for a moment, because in my worldview, these events were actually separate. And then I can share whatever it is that I feel differently, but it's only once we're having a respectful conversation. And we're both right, because truth is different for us. What's the conversation? That I need to dominate this person? They need to be like me? Or can we have a dialogue, no matter what they say? That's radical inclusivity. All right, so if we can shut down the slide for a second, I want to give a chance to reach back to our viewers for a second with these questions. And this is a two-parter. I'd like to know what your experience has been of trying to tell others how you responded to a trauma, or if you don't want to go to the trauma place, a difficult situation. I want to know what happened when you tried to share with someone else, what some of your experiences were. So if anyone wants to pipe in, that would be lovely. And just while you're typing, or while you're thinking, or while you're writing, to say, when we suffer, or when we have these difficult experiences, it makes other people uncomfortable. That's something for sure that it does, particularly if they haven't had your experience, or it's not personal to you. So, we know that other people get uncomfortable when we talk about these things, and it's a risk just to bring it up.
So Tammy says, even some well-meaning people have tried to tell me how I feel based on how they think they would feel.
Yes.
I've had a lot of different experiences. I've had certain people, therapists even, who can hold it and not judge it, and I can find myself, safe in that interaction, and then I've had the experience, I don't know if other people have had this experience, but of feeling, after I shared my experience, feeling a little bit ashamed, or embarrassed, or like, oh my gosh, what are they thinking about me? And what are they thinking about my family? You know, like I've had that experience as well.
Yeah.
Or like that, you know, there's that TV commercial where about the, you know, when the parent tells the other parent about the child that's doing drugs, and the other parent like just can't handle it. So just Hannah says, I was told I was being dramatic to the point where I started to believe it was true about me as well. It took several years to receive the appropriate validation and realize I wasn't dramatic or misremembering. And Kayla says they wanted to fix it right away and then never bring it up again. You know,
Right.
right. Okay, and never bring it up again.
If that can happen, right?
What?
Kayla?
So much judgment, just not wanting to talk about things because people say things like, you should just.
Yeah.
Hannah and Kayla, you wrote it to all panelists. I'm hoping that you meant to say all panelists and attendees, because other people can't. That's why I read them, so other people can see it, but those things aren't accessible to the rest of the people.
Thank you, though, Kathy, for reading them out loud. I really
Sure.
appreciate it. I've had the experience, too, of like really wanting to share, but like being exhausted. And just a core belief, right? Just thinking, oh God, no one's going to understand this. And just not.
Oh, there's tons of that. I've had that experience too, where it's not worth it to say,
Right.
like, it's not worth it to say how I feel, because it's so different from, you know, from what it's just going to take too much effort, you know, and especially if I'm in a tender or vulnerable place, like, it's, you know, it's not worth it to reach out, because I can't be hurt again now, you know.
Right. And it's actually, that's one of those coping things that happens so intuitively that we have to understand is adaptive, that protection to the self. The second part of my question was this: what has happened to you if your viewpoint or truth is actually validated by the person who's listening to you? Has anyone had that experience?
Yes, I've had that experience. And that's what I was saying, is just in therapy, or like, I remember one time calling you, Judith, and with friends who could hold the space, you know, and also in parent cafes. I mean, I want to say this because I think that that's one of the tenets behind parent cafes, is that they're places for people to be able to express how they feel and what their experience is, and be witnessed, but not be judged, you know, not be judged, not be shamed, just to be able to get it out there. So, and just have people be able to just hold it. And I think that's one of the powers of the parent cafes and the other cafes, is just being able to feel connected to people when you're sharing your truth, you know.
So that's why acknowledging someone's truth, if they come and tell you their experience, even, you know, Kathy gave that great example of that. So as opposed to maybe how you would feel about what happens when somebody gets raped. But it's amazing the experience when someone's able to hold space for your truth, to be able to validate you. When I think back to the young girl I was when my friend was murdered, I can't even imagine what it would have been like if someone could have just sat and listened and said, okay. I mean, it's such a gift you give if you can just acknowledge someone else's truth. So if there's any more comments on this, it's great. If not, I'd like to, oh no, well, what time are we?
Just we only have like 4 more minutes.
Okay, we only have 4 more minutes. All right, so what we've talked about today, I'll do a little roundup here, is one, we've talked about requiring the understanding of the survivor's location, and also really getting clearer about what our location was before the trauma ever happened. That's called context, and context is of utmost importance. it's a way that you can advocate for yourself, because if anyone in the helping professions is not asking to hear your location for anything, it's a little bit of a problem, because things affect you the way they do because of who you are. Because of who you are, and that's not a problem. You are not broken, and there's nothing wrong with you. You're a human being having experiences. So we require that understanding of the survivor's location. And then what we were just talking about is very similar, but it's acknowledging the truth of someone's experience, and that there is no single truth, and practicing something we call radical inclusivity, which involves being open, being aware of your own biases and letting them come or stay as a conscious place in your thoughts. And then just understanding that there's a very broad range that goes so much further beyond any one of us. You know, that truth is a woman named Haraway who said that truth, she's another feminist, she said that there is no single truth, but truth is made up of the multiple truths of all peoples. And that I always picture it like we're a big jigsaw puzzle, aren't we? And each of us represent one piece of that jigsaw puzzle as an element of truth. So your truth is not imaginary. Your truth is not illusory, as it's often called, or imagined in your head. Your truth is an important, solid piece of who you are, your location, and your experience and the response you've had, which isn't a choice. It's something, the way our organism creates homodynamic balance, how we adjust and balance our way through life and become survivors. So I'm going to hand this back to Kathy.
Okay, let's see the step that we're going to start at next time.
Okay, so we are going to start next time and talk about validating that experience in something we call a non-hierarchical framework. Hierarchy means ranking things, and we're going to talk about equality. We're going to talk about not ranking things, and then we're going to talk about empowerment as a co-creator and what that means.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you everybody for being here. Please fill out the poll as you leave, and tomorrow we'll hope you'll join an upcoming webinar. Tomorrow is on protecting children from cyberbullying. And I asked them to discuss not only when your child is, or a child is the victim of cyberbullying, but when you think about it, there are many more kids that are involved in doing the bullying than being the victims. So what happens when you know that your child is participating in bullying another child? Which I think is rarely discussed. It's usually discussed like, what do you do when your child is being hurt by a bully? Cassie will be here on Friday, interactive discussion, riding the Corona coaster, the holiday edition. And then we have a whole set of things for next week as well. And Judith will be back next Wednesday with part 3. This is our social media campaign. What would you like to amplify coming out of today's webinar? What are we amplifying? What do we want? What will bring us together? You know, people's truth. Show your love. If you like the webinar series, we need some green energy. We need some money to keep it going. There's no funding for this, and we'd like to be able to compensate some presenters that come, you know, multiple times. So if you like the webinar series and you have in you to be able to give a little something, we would appreciate it. Next is the reminder to wear your mask. We have some that also have carry our messages, which hopefully are your messages as well. Your values. I was thinking values, Judith, is another one of those psychological lenses, like what you value.
Yes.
And then the last thing is just if you know someone who you think would do a great webinar or you want to share or host a conversation, please just email me and we'll talk. So actually, we're ending a little 1 minute early.
Oh, no. Amplify respect. How about that?
Amplify respect. Yes, hashtag amplify respect. I think that is something that is, you know, a subcurrent of everything that you're talking about with regard to, you know, witnessing other people's truths.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of aha moments in this, and so I'm sure a lot of the people that were attending did too. And there's going to be thinking about it until the next time that you meet. So thank you, Judith. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.